Oh, there it goes.
Unmute. Okay, I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah.
There it goes. We have a microphone in the room that is very sensitive.
Very sensitive, yeah.
All right. Well, once again, thank you everyone for your patience and welcome to our active process lecture series. Today we'll be focusing on the process of self as context, and I'll be introducing our own Donald Marks. Donald Marks is a PsyD and associate professor and director of clinical training for the Doctor of Psychology program in Combined School and Clinical Psychology at Keene University in Union, New Jersey, where he also serves as the associate director of Keene Psychological Services and the doctoral program's on-site training clinic. As a clinical health psychologist, Dr. Marks researches the effectiveness of compassion-focused interventions for patients living with health anxiety, chronic pain, and life-limiting illness. Dr. Marks completed his postdoctoral fellowship in psycho-oncology and palliative medicine at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Welcome, Don, and welcome everyone to our lecture today.
Right. Thanks so much, Abu. I'm going to try to figure out, we got a complex technological arrangement here, so I'm going to try to figure out how to share my screen and get the slides to everybody. Hopefully this is going to work. There we go. I'm hoping that everybody can see that. And I'm also hoping that I can advance the slides. Okay, there we go. So I am going to talk tonight. This is part of our ACT tutorial series, kind of introduction to ACT processes. And I'm going to talk specifically about self as context tonight. And I'm going to try to talk about it in a way that I hope is evocative of some of the things that you might do with self as context as a process in mindfulness and compassion focused therapies, and of course in ACT. So this is what I've got on tap for us. So I'm hoping we can kind of consider some of the challenges that self as context can help us to address, clinical challenges. I'm interested in providing a definition. It's a hard thing to define self as context. In some ways, it's the most mysterious or the most mystical of the ACT processes. So I'm going to try to do my best to give you a definition of self as context and a little bit of a developmental perspective on it. And then explore the implications of cultivating self as context relative to self as content, or in ACT terms, conceptualized. Right. Can we mute that? Oh, very good. Okay, thank you, Abu. All right. The mysteries of self as context and the mysteries of technology. And then I want to just identify the ways that some other therapies, because self as context is not something that is exclusively in the province of ACT, although it's ACT terminology, it can be found in other therapies. So I want to highlight a couple of ways that other therapies are using a process that is self as context, and then just talk a little bit about the empirical study of self as context and the evidence base for it. So that's the plan for the evening, and just kind of give you a sense of where we are in the hexaflex, the context. Yeah. A lot of echo here. You got it? Okay, very good. Okay, so just to take a look at where we are in the hexaflex, self as context is sort of in the lower middle portion of the hexaflex, and we often will talk about different ways you can go when you're working with someone in an ACT context. So you can kind of go left on the hexaflex, and that would be moving into increasing acceptance or maybe increasing diffusion from thoughts or feelings. You can go right and focus on values and on behavioral activation and committed action. Or you could be where we're going to be tonight, which is really in the center of the model. And it's about being flexibly present and taking perspective, adopting particular perspectives to maximize our flexibility relative to experience. So that's just to orient us in the hexaflex. And then I thought maybe what I could do is just kind of talk about a few of the ACT terms around selfing. So in an important sense, the self as context process is about who we are. And one of the things that we might say is that it's a process that's expressly concerned with selfing. And so ACT is thinking about selfing as a self is a verb, right? So something we're doing actively. And it provides us with this opportunity to kind of ask the question about how we how we go about it. And we might do that by identifying with particular stories about events or experiences, or maybe even identifying with the events and experiences themselves. And we would call that self as content in an ACT perspective. Or we might focus on the ongoing unfolding of experience, moment to moment, the events that kind of fill our lives as they unfold, and tracking them as they unfold. And so in the ACT model, we would think about that as self as process. And then there's this other perspective from which we experience the unfolding events, from which we can kind of take a step back and see those events unfolding. And that's this self as context process. So it's an aspect of selfing or a way of selfing, and it's a pretty complex and multifaceted dimension of human psychology. So maybe I can attempt to illustrate this a little bit. Abu mentioned in the introduction that I'm a health psychologist, and I work with people who have life-limiting illness or chronic pain, and often with people, my training, my postdoctoral training was really focused on palliative care psychology, so working with people at end of life. And I think about the different contributions to suffering when we're living with illness. And one of the ways that we might think about this is that, and it's true for all of us all the time, but it's specifically clear in circumstances where we're facing illness or pain, that we're vulnerable and we're open in a certain sense that is vulnerable to hurt. One of my favorite philosophers who I'm constantly quoting is this man, William Desmond. And William Desmond talks about human beings being porous. And so we're kind of open or porous to experience. And we might think about the vulnerability that we experience in illness as part of what it is to be human and mortal. Even if we're not in contact with this all the time, that vulnerability is there. And there could be a lot of other aspects of our experience that kind of fit under the umbrella of that vulnerability and contribute to suffering. So in a certain sense, all the other, I've got vulnerability at the top of this slide, but all the other elements on the slide kind of fall under the heading or umbrella of vulnerability. And so like there could be all kinds of different problems that we face. There could be psychological uncertainty in illness. However we want the future to unfold, we can't guarantee that it will unfold in the way that we want. In certain situations, there can be judgments that are related to our cultural beliefs or our context. We might face marginalization. A lot of people that I work with who are living with advanced illness tell me that in their families and in their workplaces, once people hear about their illness, it's as though their voice is less welcome in conversation. They feel kind of marginalized or even silenced. And we might experience a kind of spiritual distress in these situations. We might feel, some people will feel sometimes that they've been abandoned by God in these kinds of situations, or they just feel very poorly prepared for facing illness. And so all of these things contribute to suffering. And self as context, what it does here is it gives us an opportunity to ask the question, who suffers? So who suffers? And we could turn this around, by the way, and we could kind of take it in another direction. And we could say, turning the tables a little bit, that when we encounter transformative experience in life, like awe or wonder, that also depends on our openness. So here, our vulnerability is our openness. And we could be psychologically captivated or even astonished by beauty, maybe when we're looking out over a beautiful valley or a beautiful natural expanse and seeing the splendor of mountains and trees. This past weekend, seeing the leaves beginning to come out, had some of these kinds of captivating experiences. And we experience sensual pleasures. You eat a good meal, or you have a great cup of coffee, and you have these opportunities to savor pleasure. We could find ourselves experiencing a kind of spiritual expansiveness, maybe a sense of connection with friends and families. And these things might even happen in the context of some cultural practice or a cultural event, part of a family tradition, perhaps. And all of these things could be under the heading of openness, contributing to wonder. And what we could say from the standpoint of self as context is, who wonders, who enjoys? Who wonders and who enjoys? Got like multiple computers on this stand here, so it's very confusing about like what button to press. So here's a slide. Some of you may have seen this. It's one of my favorites. I've always kind of enjoyed this as I think about this is me walking my dog, Moxie, who's going to make an appearance later on in this presentation. If you've seen this slide, you know that this is a kind of invocation of present moment awareness, right? And the way that we're all captivated, us human beings have a very busy thought bubble. And, in this case, the dog has a thought bubble that includes just what is in front, just what is there present in the moment, just what is in front of him. And we're constantly engaging in all of these kinds of verbal representations, right? Or re-experiencing of other events, other places, other times. It gets very hectic and very busy. It reminds me, there's a wonderful poem. It's an ancient poem from the Chinese scholar Wu Min, a really wonderful Zen scholar. 10,000 flowers in spring, the moon in autumn, a cool breeze in summer, snow in winter. If your mind isn't clouded by unnecessary things, this is the best season of your life. And so there's this way that there's something really relevant to self as context here. That self as context is paying attention to the space of awareness and the perspective that the observer perspective, if you will, that persists through time and that we know as our own. So whether our mind is cloudy, whether our mind is filled with all those representations of other kinds of experiences in our life, or whether our mind is like the unclouded Zen mind of my dog Moxie, there's a perspective. There's a space in which these experiences unfold. And we might say it this way in terms of self as context. Who recalls the busy events, the calls, the emails, the car accidents, whatever it might be? Who recalls those events of the day, and who sees the trees? There's one other thing about this that I just want to highlight, and that is that there's a sense of this being a locus or a place, that there's some sense not just of a perspective of a person who sees, but of a place where these events unfold. And that's another important dimension of self as context. So we have both a perspective and a locus. One of my favorite artist is Sun Ra, and Sun Ra was very famous for this. He had a documentary that he made with this title. He had an album with this title, Space is the Place. And we might say that our self in self as context is the space or the place where it all happens. It's the locus of observation. And this is an ancient idea. This is not just something that shows up in ACT. I mean, ACT is very innovative, and there's a lot of really cool new things in it. And there's also this appreciation of a very ancient perspective. And so there's a couple of examples here. Thomas à Kempis, so 15th century. In the 15th century, Thomas à Kempis writes, "For wherever you go, you take yourself with you, and you shall always find yourself." And that might, some of you might be familiar with the book by John Kabat-Zinn, "Wherever you go, there you are." Well, those words, "wherever you go, there you are," those were words from Thomas à Kempis. And then, so that's the idea of this persistent perspective, the sense that there's this locus from which we can see. And then there's also the sense that this space of awareness is actually quite vast, that there's all kinds of possible sensations and memories and experiences that can unfold in this space. And this reminds me of the great quote from Walt Whitman, "I am large, I contain multitudes." So you think about this with ourselves and our clients, that there is both a persistent sense of perspective, and there is also a multiplicitous and capacious perspective that each of us has. It's a kind of helpful way of understanding selfing that allows for this sense of the self as spacious. So I'm just going to go back a second here and talk about these ways of selfing again. So in ACT, we will often talk about self as content, which is a kind of fusion. I think we had a session on fusion a couple of weeks ago, right, Boo? Yeah, so it's a kind of fusion with the prominent content of consciousness. So we could be fused with a mood, or we could be fused with a thought, like I'm a loser, or I'm doing great. And we can think about this as being who we are. There's a kind of way that we could be fused with even a role that we play, a job we have. It could be a bodily state, like I'm a sick person or I'm a healthy, fit person. There's a way that we can see ourselves as that content. And there is, as we were talking about before, this way that we can identify with the ongoing moment-to-moment awareness of experience unfolding, right? And there's some new perspective that's always available. And that's attending to self as process, right? So that's another important way that we can think about the self. And then, as we've just been talking about, there's this way that we can think about the ground of all our experience, the perspective of the experiencer, the self that experiences emotions, thoughts, roles, bodily states. So it's that sort of step back from the identification to the awareness of these events as they unfold, right? And this actually is kind of helpful because we can work with people and kind of highlight these different ways of identification. And we can also see, it doesn't take too long, I think it's pretty easy for us to see the ways that our psychological suffering is related to the self as content perspective. So we can often exacerbate our suffering by certain kinds of habits of mind that minimize our flexibility relative to our experience. Right? So our suffering might increase to the extent that we lose touch with our awareness of ourselves as the space in which experience unfolds. Right? So I think there's a really important understanding here that there's a distinction between the awareness of self as context, the awareness of self as the space where experience unfolds, and the degree of fusion or rigidity that we experience. Right? So when we buy into these particular self-stories, these particular ways of understanding ourselves, we do that at a price, right? So, you'll hear many people say this, maybe you've said this, I probably said this already today a couple of times, I'm the kind of person who, right? And you fill in that blank. And there's a way that is fencing us in, right? There's a way that can be a kind of prescription that we make about ourselves. And so what we're really talking about here in self as context is kind of seeing that as an identification and then asking who it is that notices, right? And so it gives us a chance, and this is really important, especially in cases where people are experiencing a lot of distress or they feel very overwhelmed in life. And people that I work with who are experiencing advanced illness, they'll often think of themselves as being a burden. They'll become completely identified with this notion that they are a burden to others. And if we can get a little space, if we can get, when we think about that ACT process of diffusion, we get a little space from that idea, and then we might even be able to get a little space, a little broader understanding of who the person is, and also a sense of their infinite variety and the unlimited perspectives that are available to any given person. So we begin to introduce more and more flexibility as we move away from self as content and towards self as context. Okay. Many of you are probably familiar with this metaphor. This is probably the most prominent of the ACT metaphors used to talk about self as context. It is sometimes used as the way of introducing the idea. And the notion here of the chessboard is that we can get into a kind of back and forth with ourselves. We can maybe in identification with particular forms of self as content, or trying to combat particular forms of self as content, we can kind of conduct an argument with ourselves. Well, I'm a loser and I'm incompetent. Well, no, I'm actually, and let me show you the evidence. Here are the reasons that I actually am competent. Here are the reasons that I'm not a loser. And you can see that we get into this sort of chess match with ourselves, a back and forth about the content of thought. Who am I? Right? And we can spend our lives really desperately trying to convince ourselves that we're not the person that we're most afraid that we are, right? And we end up kind of identifying with these good dimensions and bad dimensions of the self. And so in this metaphor of the chessboard, what we consider is the possibility that rather than one side or the other of the argument, we're the board where the process takes place. Well, so what's helpful about that, right? The question often comes back, well, what's helpful about that? Well, there's a couple of interesting things about the board. Two things I'll just mention right off the bat. And, if we get a chance to do some questions, I'll be happy to take your questions about this. But one thing that's really important about the board is it's completely in contact with all the pieces. Right. And that's something important about this space of self as context, is that it is open to the unfolding dimensions of experience in their entirety. Right. So all the dimensions of experience unfolding. So it touches all the pieces. But then there's another thing about the board, and that is that it holds the pieces up with no effort at all. The board expends no effort. And that's something important about self as context too. Self as context, you have self as context, and there's no effort to it at all. So I just tossed those two dimensions out as important aspects of this idea. Okay. Well, if that wasn't confusing enough, what I want to do next is talk a little bit about self as context as a psychological process, and particularly look at the way that self as context is described in the ACT literature. So I'm going to start with the ACT book from it's the 2012, the second edition of the ACT book, Hayes, Strassel, and Wilson. First one's 1999, and this is the 2012 one. And I just want to read this definition to you. So this is verbatim from the book. The psychological literature contains numerous terms and concepts that allude to this aspect of self, a transcendent sense of self, the observing self, noticing self, continuity of consciousness, pure awareness, and others. Spiritual and religious traditions similarly cite a variety of relevant terms: spirituality, which we'll come back to shortly, a no-thing self, big mind, wise mind, and so on. So that, I think, helps us sort of see the way that this idea of self as context has kind of been transmitted in the ways that different traditions point to it. Then the next, this is again directly from page 85 in the book, the next paragraph, we are speaking of an aspect of self that metaphorically cannot be looked at, but instead must be looked from. Right, so we're the observer perspective from which we look. From the inside out, it is seemingly not an it at all, and having multiple names reflects the challenge of naming a process that has no thing-like properties that one can readily detect. It is not possible to contact fully the limits of consciousness consciously. You see that this self as context idea is a mysterious idea. And it's a mysterious idea that isn't, and it's not another object. Right? In a sense, it's pure subjectivity. It's not another object. Right? So I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit more and talk about some of its dimensions. And to do this, I'm sorry I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this. I got to take a little detour into RFT. So relational frame theory, as most of you probably are familiar with, is the theory of language that supports contextual behavioral science and acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's predicated on this idea of relational framing and derived relational responding. And that's expressed in this slide in a relatively simplistic way. We see a picture of a cat there. You know, there's a little image of the cat there, and you see the word meow, which represents the sound that the cat makes, and you see the word cat, and it's in quotes because it's the spoken word cat. So a cat arrives in the room, we see the cat, we say, oh, cat, there's the cat, right? The cat then makes the sound meow, we say, oh, that's the cat, right? So we have a set of relations there between the word cat and the actual cat. I mean, we've only got a picture of a cat. We don't have an actual cat here, but if we had an actual cat here, we'd refer to that. But we have the word cat, we have an actual cat, and we have the word cat, and we have meow, right? The sound that the cat makes. And interestingly, there's this funny thing that humans can do, and we seem to be the only species that can actually do this, is that when somebody tells us that that word cat is in a frame of equivalence, or basically it points to that animal, the cat, and that word cat points to that sound meow, then we very quickly derive a relationship between meow and the cat, right? Oh, yeah, the cat and meow are connected, and we don't have to learn that in any way. It doesn't have to be trained. It's just something that we're able to do. There's a very technical sort of RFT illustration of this. It talks about which relations are trained and which relations are derived. There's something called mutual combinatorial entailment, so that when we learn that that word cat refers to the cat in the room, we also know that when we see that cat, we can apply the word cat to the animal that we see, right? So we learn that in both directions without having to be trained in both directions. So this is sort of the basics, very simplistic. We're going to have another session about RFT in a few weeks. It's a very simplistic introduction to RFT, to relational framing, that I want to introduce for this reason. And that is to point out that there are many, many different kinds of frames. This is some material from, some of you may know Eric Fox. Eric Fox has a wonderful training site. I highly, highly recommend it to you. His tutorial on RFT is fantastic and fun. And believe it or not, RFT can be fun, and it really is on his tutorial. But this is just highlighting some of the kinds of frames that there are. There are different ways of relating to experience that we can consistently apply, and that we do consistently apply because they're reinforced ways of relating to experience. So there are many different kinds of frames. With the cat illustration that I was sharing, that's called frames of equivalence, right? The word cat, the cat, and the meow, they're all related, right? And they're related because they all refer to the cat. Each one of them is kind of in a frame of same, we might say, sameness, right? But there are also other kinds of frames. There are frames of larger than, smaller than. There are frames of distinction. This is not that, right? Like on this example here, we have one where, Madonna is not Elvis, and Elvis is not my daddy, and Madonna is not my daddy. So there's all these different ways that we have frames of distinction that we're using all the time. This is relevant to self as context in some important ways. Self as context is in many ways contingent on this particular way of framing that RFT refers to as deictic framing. It comes from the Greek word deixis, which means pointing, to point. And so we have ways of pointing to ourselves and to things that are not ourselves. So we can point to I and you, and we can point to here and there, and we can point to now and then. So we can do this in space, and we can do this in time, and we can do this relative to one person and another person, right? So that we can do I here now, and I here now is the perspective of self as context, right? So in other words, what ACT is suggesting here is that we learn how to do self as context through the use of learning these deictic frames. When we learn to do these kinds of deictic pointing frame ways of framing, and we learn to do this throughout our life, and this makes it possible for us to have this perspective of self as context. Now, there's actually some specific, very specific kinds of frames that are involved in self as context. So one of the things that you might have already recognized is that when we're talking about self as context, when it was in that quote from Thomas à Kempis, wherever you go, there you are, there's a sense of this being a process that is distinct. And so we've referred to this as a frame of distinction. And this process is not the same as the thoughts and feelings that the process notices. So my thoughts and feelings are not who I am. I have a sense of continuity. Wherever I go, there I am. But that's not the same as my thoughts and feelings. And we might even say that there's a part of us that watches as we struggle with experience or as we enjoy experience. And that part or that perspective is not changed by the experience. So in RFT terms, that's a use of a frame of distinction. Right? So what's happening in self as context is the employment of this frame of distinction. At the same time, we have this sense of the capaciousness, the Walt Whitman idea of I contain multitudes, the capaciousness of awareness. That's a frame of hierarchy. And so we have this sense that we are greater than any one internal experience that we might have, there's a kind of infinite spaciousness to the self. That's what the ACT book was referring to about the limits of consciousness can't be consciously realized, right? There's always something more. There's always another possible perspective or point of view on our experience. So that's a hierarchical frame. And so that's a very technical definition of self as context. We see that it's grounded in this understanding, the scientific understanding of language that underlies, that supports contextual behavioral science. So it's grounded in RFT. And this is something that we learn developmentally. Throughout our lives, we're being asked to perform these kinds of pointing tasks. And we do this with children all the time. We're very frequently, we ask children, what did you do? What did you do last week? What did you do on Saturday? What did you do on your birthday last week? Where will you and your family go on vacation this summer? How does it feel when you eat? How does your sister feel when you eat her candy? Right. So what we're doing there when we ask these kinds of questions is that we're actually engaging each other, and we're engaging kids in this case. We're engaging each other in this process of taking perspective, of using those deictic frames and pointing. What was my experience? Sometimes when kids first hear the question, what do you think your sister feels when you eat her candy? Sometimes they'll say, I feel good when I eat the candy, right? Because they'll answer from their perspective. And so then we practice, we'll ask again and we'll say, no, what does your sister feel, right? And so ask the child to think about it from another person's perspective. So we're asking them to do deictic framing there. And we're specifically asking them to use a frame of distinction and recognize the difference between their perspective and their sister's perspective. And so we're learning how to do this all through our lives. And self as context, as a therapeutic process, is sort of tapping into the learning that we all have as we, over time, just get this sense of a self that continues in time and is not necessarily changed by experience. Right? The perspective is not changed by the experience. And at the same time, the sense of self that is large enough to contain the experience. So another way of thinking about this, which could be helpful therapeutically, is that self as context is kind of like a radical diffusion. Right? So if diffusion is recognizing that I can put some distance between myself and a given thought. Like often in ACT, we'll talk about when we're fused with an idea, when the idea seems to be sort of running the show in our life. It's like it's right up here. The idea is right up, maybe it's traumatic memory or something like that. It's right up here on us, and we can't get any distance from it. And then we engage in diffusion. We begin to get a little, I'm having the thought or I'm having the memory of that event. We get a little distance. I'm trying to get my hand on the camera here. Get a little distance from the event, right? And we can begin to see other things in our lives. So in a sense, self as context is a radical form of that. And the radical form is recognizing that we can diffuse from everything. And that when we diffuse from everything, we remain thoroughly in contact with it, right? So we're neither, when we go back to the chessboard metaphor, we're neither side of the board, but we are the board. We're neither set of the pieces. We are the board, and we're in contact with all the experience. but at the same time, that experience does not define us, right? So there's a way that we could think about self as context as a kind of radical diffusion. Another way to think about it, which I think can be very helpful, is to think about it as a kind of, I'm having a little technical difficulty here. Give me a sec. There we go. We can think about it as radical acceptance, right? So there is a way that when we're in contact with what's unfolding in consciousness, that we are turning toward that experience as we make contact with it. And that in a sense, when we're attending to the spaciousness of ourselves and the openness to unfolding experience that we have, we're not resisting any experience. We're open to it, accepting it. And in a certain sense, it makes possible the openness that allows for that. It makes possible ways of relating to others. It introduces that acceptance, introduces a great deal of flexibility, because I don't have to change my experience. I can make room for it. I'm spacious. It's possible for me to have it. And that gives me a lot of flexibility for working with people and for my relationships with others. So that's where I'd like to turn next. I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about how self as context, I think maybe in a certain sense, the most important therapeutic dimension of self as context is that it's a source of peace, empathy, and compassion. So it has implications, this awareness of the unchanging self that can make room for experience. It has implications for spirituality and transcendence, for our interdependence and shared consciousness, what we might think of as the I-thou relationship. If it's RFT and deictic framing, it's the I-you relationship. If it's Martin Buber, it's the I-thou relationship. And it also makes possible a sense of compassion, and also some of the work that we do under the heading of self-compassion. So as I mentioned before, this is kind of ancient idea, and other people in other forms of psychology have talked about this importance of this observer self, particularly in the context of understanding mysticism. Right? So there is this transcendent dimension to this self that can always take another perspective and that isn't changed. That perspective is possible. It's not obliterated. It's not diminished by any kind of content of consciousness. The perspective is always there. And so there is a spiritual dimension that it arises out of our recognition that there's a distinction between the content of our experience, the verbally known content of our experience, and the perspective from which we see that experience. And so that observer perspective is integral to most spiritual traditions. I highlight this book here. I recommend it to you. It's a kind of an old book now. I think it's 1982. Arthur Dykman, The Observing Self, Mysticism and Psychotherapy. Very much an early exploration of self as context. And there are many ancient philosophical traditions that emphasize this, and I just highlighted a couple of them here. I'm having a little trouble seeing my own slides at this point. It's unfortunate, but the angle is bad for seeing these slides. Maybe I'm just, give me a second. I have a printout of the. I just want to highlight a couple of things here in this model of ancient understanding. So there's a philosophy called Muntu, which is an African Congolese philosophy, and Jill Stoddard, who is one of the authors of a wonderful book that I highly recommend to you called The Big Book of Act Metaphors, which has like all of these metaphors that we're talking about tonight and many, many more in it. She talks about this idea of a consciousness that exists pre-life, before life, during life and after life, and it's a continuous and unchanging consciousness throughout, right? So this is a spiritual dimension of deictic framing, or self as context. And this shows up in all kinds of traditions. So Empedocles, I mean, some of you might know about, as I used to say when I was a kid, Empedocles, but Empedocles, he a famous pre-Socratic philosopher who was enamored of the Pythagoreans, and so believed in reincarnation. He had this idea that he had his perspective, his I here now, had existed through time, and there had been many different things, a boy and a girl and a bush and a bird, and a leaping, journeying fish over time. Right? So we have these ancient ideas of continuous perspective. And same thing shows up in Stoicism. So we have just one little quote here from Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic, who says that despite things, objective things do not lay hold of the soul, but stand quiescent without. Right? So the soul is somehow dependent. The observer self is somehow independent from the things that unfold in it. And then something from the medieval tradition. You have this famous illustration of the soul traveling through time that the Venerable Bede talks about. There's an awareness, there's a sense of self, and it's flying through time. And suddenly there's a consciousness. We're conscious of it as the soul, like a bird, flies into a warm and well-lit mead hall, and then it flies out the other end. And we don't know what happens to it when it flies out the other side. So there's a kind of sense of continuity over time in all of these great spiritual traditions that we might say is consistent with self as context, and that needs this process of self as context in order to be articulated. One other thing, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, there's a very famous injunction that's in Western philosophy, it's the injunction from the oracle at Delphi that Socrates refers to frequently, and that is this injunction to know oneself. And knowing oneself is a self as context move. And what's interesting about it is that when we first say, oh, I'm going to know myself, what happens is that we start doing self as content. And what happens in the Socratic dialogues is that there's a constant movement away from self as content to self as a perspective that is usually identified as reason, but it's an intuitive perspective. And so there's a way that we are, in a sense, saying, know thyself, to point to the fact that we can't ever actually do that. And that's actually a delightful thing. That's a wonderful thing and a therapeutic thing. I can't be known in any kind of entirety. I can't be pinned down. That I remain a mystery. And that's a beautiful unfolding aspect of my being, that I remain a mystery. There are limitless possibilities in that way. And so that's another ancient use and reference to this process that we're calling, in ACT terms, self as context. Self as context is also fundamental to interdependence. If you buy the idea of deictic framing, and you buy the idea that I have the sense of me relative to you, right? There are ancient traditions that express this too. There's the Ubuntu tradition, which says, I am because you are, right? I am because you are. There's a way that our relatedness is implicit in this perspective of the observer self. And so our independence is actually a reflection of our interdependence. Our consciousness or our awareness is only possible because of the consciousness or awareness of others. Right? This relatedness is foundational to self as context. I see that you also see. And there are all kinds of great figures in the history of philosophy who articulate this. I picked a few of my favorites here out of a hat just to kind of illustrate this point. One of my favorite quotations from C.S. Lewis, the great C.S. Lewis, says, "Friendship is born at that moment when one person says to another, 'What, you too? I thought I was the only one.'" So it's like seeing things from the other person's perspective that makes possible friendship. Henry Nouwen says, "Compassion is not an individual character trait, a personal attitude, or a special talent, but a way of living together." And it's self as context that makes it possible, the recognition of the other person's point of view. And then one of my favorites from Thomas Merton, "The whole idea of compassion is based on a keen awareness of the interdependence of all these living beings, which are all part of one another and all involved in one another." So we see that in using frames of distinction, this is kind of interesting, in using frames of distinction, we end up also recognizing the profound connectedness, and we shift from our frame of distinction in that way to a hierarchical frame that is inclusive. And probably the greatest example of that inclusive way of framing is compassion. And so it's perspective taking that makes possible compassion. One of my favorite renderings of this is James Fowler. Some of you might know the psychologist James Fowler. He wrote about faith development. But Fowler says, "I see you seeing me. I see the me that you see. I see you seeing me. I see the me that you see." And so there's this way that we have the capacity to put ourselves in another person's shoes and even to see the other person seeing us, right? And that gives us a kind of richness of perspective, a depth of perspective that allows for compassionate interaction. In a sense, we can practice extending that to others and extending that to ourselves. And we can envision bringing compassion to ourselves and to others. And this is all, if you look at the work of Paul Gilbert, which I highly recommend to you, the book that I'm citing here is The Compassionate Mind. If you look at that work, compassion is all about being able to have a perspective that allows me to see another perspective and to have a perspective on taking a perspective. So we very quickly get into a kind of multi-layered, maybe an infinite regress, but it's a regress that makes possible connection to another person's suffering or another person's sorrow. It's instrumental. Those of you working therapeutically, it's absolutely instrumental. There's no other process of greater importance in therapeutic work. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about this from the standpoint of Buber's work, Martin Buber's work. That's a reference here to Buber's great book, I and Thou. And what Buber does, which I think is really important and is actually helpful in understanding the utility of self as context, is that he makes a distinction between two kinds of relating. He talks about I-it relating, so the I sees the other as an object, and he talks about I-thou relating, the I sees the other as a person, and so to do that, to see the other as a person, I have to do that perspective taking that says, I see you seeing me, right? And it's in that I-thou non-objectifying way of interacting that the full power of self as context is born. And there's a really important way that I-it relating, as Buber describes it, is actually self as content, right? That what's happening there is an identification with objects. And when we shift to an identification with perspectives, then these relational dimensions become possible. An expansive awareness becomes possible when we can move from identification with the object of our thoughts to an awareness of our thoughts as thoughts. Okay. So I just want to say, because I've been really kind of highlighting these benefits of self as context and kind of, in a way, denigrating the perspective that identifies with particular aspects of consciousness, which ACT calls conceptualized self or self as content. And I just wanted to be fair and to acknowledge what people who are more well-versed theoretically in ACT than me have written about this, is that not all forms of conceptualized self are somehow bad, right? Like, it's not a matter of like, oh, okay, if you think about yourself as a committed friend, and you identify with that, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It could be a quite helpful thing. If you think about yourself as a hard worker, that might be a beneficial thing. The issue really with conceptualized self is that the tables of the identification get turned very quickly, right? And there can be restrictive behaviors that follow. I can kind of put myself in a verbal straitjacket, if you will. And it becomes most problematic when you have to somehow get rid of a particular version of conceptualized self, right? Or if a particular version of conceptualized self begins to really restrict the possible behaviors. If at every turn I meet, I'm broken and unacceptable, it could be really helpful to do some radical diffusion and do some self as context in that moment. And there's just a tendency in conceptualized self that it's just something that happens in conceptualized self, is that it tends to polarization. It tends to the good or the bad. And that polarization seems to be something that happens in this objective identification, right? As opposed to taking the perspective of self as context. Okay. So I promised you a little more of my dog, Moxie. That's Moxie right there. That's Moxie having some restricted flexibility. He had to wear one of those inflatable collars for a day. He was pretty unhappy about it. And his range of enjoyment and engagement in life was seriously affected by this. And I think about, like, when I'm identified with a particular evaluation of myself, or I'm working with somebody who's really identified in this way, like the self as content, the fusion is really right up on us at those times. I think about that as kind of like the verbal equivalent of wearing that collar. And so what I wanted to talk about were just some metaphors that we can use, metaphors that can sort of loosen things up, right? So it's another passage actually from the ACT book. This is a good one, and I kind of want to spend a little time with this because I think there's some really important metaphors here. So this is, again, we're talking now about the therapeutic importance of self as context and the flexibility that it affords. So this is directly from the book. ACT asks a lot of the client. It asks that verbal defenses be reduced. It asks that psychological monsters be faced. No one can be expected to face psychological pain if self-destruction, even if metaphorical, seems to be the likely result. In order to face one's monsters head on, it is necessary to find a place from which this is possible. The solution requires that the client learn to stay in the present moment and to make contact with a larger sense of self that is not threatened by the content. So you see, this is absolutely integral to ACT. We're not doing ACT without this process, because we can't face the monsters. We can't do the heavy lifting of ACT without this perspective. So there's a bunch of different ways that we do this, and we've talked about this, but I'll just kind of reiterate a few things here. So we recognize in the work that we're doing that the I perspective is various, that there's a wide variety of experiences, and yet the I is stable. So it's various, yet it's stable. The frame of distinction, it's not the same as the experiences, and it persists. It's also a spacious awareness. It's a container. That's the hierarchical framing. It contains multitudes, and it's flexible. Right? So it allows for varied responding in accordance with whatever it is that you want to do in your life. So those are really important sort of, if you will, contextual dimensions of selfing, right? And so there are some specific ways that we can use this I, here, now perspective of self as context to promote flexible selfing. So one of the things is the variety of experience. And there are questions we can ask about the variety of experience. So these could be things like, how do you feel now? And now? And can you recall a time that you felt differently in the different moments and situations in your life? How does that differ from what you feel now? Right? So that's the variation of the I. And then we can do the stability of the point of view. The I is perspective. So notice who is noticing these thoughts, sensations, and feelings. Who notices your thoughts and feelings across your life? Today, last summer, 5 years ago, when you were a teenager. Who notices? And then also this hierarchical idea. What is unfolding in your thoughts and sensations and feelings right now? What if you are the space in which that experience unfolds? You are larger than any specific experience. Can you make room for that thought or that feeling? And then we can also talk about the self as a flexible agent and capable of values consistent responding. With this awareness, what choices do you want to make? Right? How do you want to respond to this experience? And so we have sort of a kind of agency in response to it. So those are just some ways that self as context, I, here, now promotes flexible selfing. Right? And different therapies do this differently, right? So in ACT, we often talk about, maybe some of you have done this exercise. We used to do a kind of eulogy exercise or a tombstone exercise where you have, what would you want people to say about you if this was your funeral, or you were hearing the eulogy that was given about you at the end of your life? What would you want people to say about you? I've seen many variations of this. A favorite one is the retirement party. What would you want people to say about you at your retirement? And so you're imagining yourself in the future, and you're also imagining how other people would respond to you. So there's perspective taking that's integral to that. In various forms of positive psychology, people will often ask this question, if you were your best self, what would you do now? In the age-old CBT technique, if you were a good friend, if your good friend were experiencing what you're experiencing now, what would you say to that person, right? In DBT, frequently we ask the question, what is your mind telling you now? And there's a kind of distinction between you and the mind in that case. And then in compassion-focused therapy, the primary work that we're doing is envisioning a compassionate response to the self. And oftentimes we have a practice that we do in compassion-focused ACT that's imagining a deeply compassionate other, a kind of perfect nurturer, and what the response from that perspective would be. So these are just some ways that different therapies make use of this perspective-taking process of self as context. And I just want to highlight that mindfulness, all the mindfulness-based perspectives are using this as well. Most of the mindfulness-based interventions are about making room for thoughts and feelings, allowing a broad range of inner experience, body sensations, thoughts, emotions, and reducing our reactivity to them. And there's a way that we're doing very often meditation on the movement of the breath in the body, and that's attending to the breath of life. So we're kind of attending to life unfolding, and there's an important spiritual dimension to that, this sense of vitality and this sense of even a kind of bravery or courage with which we face our experience moment to moment in this identification with the adventure of the next breath. right, in mindfulness practices. And then we're often asking ourselves, and many of the mindfulness-based interventions do this, can I breathe into this experience right now? Can I contact whatever I'm experiencing and by breathing into it? And can I breathe out engagement or commitment in this experience? So mindfulness-based therapies also making use of this self as perspective and self as locus. And so this is Moxie's experiential practice when the inflatable ring came off and he could bound around in the fields and really enjoy it. He's experiencing the fullness of life and running and kind of always seems to have a smile on his face as he does this, enjoying moment-to-moment experience. And I just kind of wanted to share a few practices that you could do that would be sort of similar, if you will, to Moxie removing the inflatable ring. So one of these would be just paying attention to what's unfolding in the mystery of your experience in this moment, right? So what is unfolding in experience here and now? And how do I want to show up for that? Right? It's that simple. That's self as context. That's what's happening in self as context. Show up for what's happening, what's unfolding here and now. Another really widely used self as context practice is the life journey. So through all the stages of our lives, we're ourselves, right? So I'm, somehow the same person as 5-year-old Don and 15-year-old Don and 40-year-old Don, and I can kind of go all the way back and all the way. I can even imagine going all the way forward, right? And so we can recall experience and imagine experience and have a sense of a continuous self as we do that. And that's a very simple practice, but it's a practice of perspective taking that is using self as context. And it's one that opens us up, right? It opens us up to the dimensions of our experience. Even if we're just imagining the perspective of ourselves at 5 and ourselves at 50, or whatever age range you want to use, there's a way that we're opening ourselves up to an awareness of those experiences. So that's another very helpful metaphor, using self as context. One of my favorite metaphors that is part of mindfulness-based stress reduction is this question that Jon Kabat-Zinn asks. He usually asks this when you're doing MBSR. Any of you have done mindfulness-based stress reduction, you'll know that there's a section of the protocol that involves mindful movement. And oftentimes people do some stretching and yoga, and you're working with people who have chronic pain quite often. And one of the questions that Jon Kabat-Zinn asks as we're doing that is my awareness of pain in pain? Is your awareness of pain in pain? And you see, that's noticing who is noticing. That's the frame of distinction, and it's a hierarchical frame, right? Because there's an awareness of our experience of pain. I already talked about the chessboard, so I won't reiterate that one, but that is a very helpful ACT metaphor. Another one that can be really useful is clouds in the sky. So we look at the sky, we see the clouds, we see the shapes and sizes change, the weather shifts, the clouds change, and above the clouds, the sky remains the sky, right? You've had that experience when you're flying, when you go up in a plane and you get above the clouds, and it's like, whoa, hey, here's the sun and the blue sky. It's right up here. We haven't seen it for days in New Jersey, but when you get above the clouds, there it is, right? And that's this awareness that is unchanged, right? It's unchanged by the movement of the clouds. Sky remains the sky. There's one of my favorite Zen koans, a beautiful Zen koan goes like this. Beneath anger, fear. Beneath fear, grief. Beneath grief, love. Beneath love, the clear blue sky. So you have that hierarchical framing, perspective taking. Some of you probably have encountered the mountain meditation before, but the mountain meditation is often used in the context of mindfulness-based therapies. This is a self as context meditation. So one imagines oneself seated, stable like a mountain, and the awareness is like a stable, vast mountain. We can imagine a majestic mountain, maybe one we've seen or one that we can just draw from our imagination. And our awareness is like this mountain. And then we can envision the weather changing on the mountain, the rain coming in, the clouds rolling out, the sun beating down, the seasons changing on the mountain. The mountain abides, the mountain stays stable through all the changing seasons. Right? And the seasons change, the snow falls, the animals hibernate, spring comes, the trees begin to bloom and leaf out, and the animals are active again. And all these changes take place and the mountain abides, right? So this is a very powerful and actually ancient self as context practice. I recommend that one to you. It's really a beautiful meditation. And then just to wrap up, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the research that's been done on self as context. And you might not be surprised about this, but out of the ACT processes, relatively less research on self as context than diffusion, acceptance, values, a lot of research on values. Mindfulness and contact with the present moment research is fairly abundant, but not as much on self as context. And there's also, actually, interestingly enough, there's not a lot of research on commitment. So those are two areas where there's work to be done. But studying self as context is interesting. There's a really nice paper. I really recommend it if you like these kinds of things. If you don't really want to read an academic article, don't read it. But like if you're interested in the empirical research about self as context, there's a really nice 2020 article by Godby and Kangas that goes through all of the research that's been done. About 20 different laboratory studies or intervention studies involving self as context. Again, like they're reviewing quite a few years of work, and there aren't that many studies. Several of the studies that were done were cross-sectional, just survey-based studies, and there are different measures for self as context, which I'll talk about in a minute, that they used. A lot of the studies that were done are very brief, single session kinds of intervention studies with relatively small samples. And they're just trying to assess the effect of a self as context intervention or induction on responses to distress, right? So only out of all the studies, the 20 studies that have been done or had been done in 2020, really only 2 of them actually involved a therapeutic intervention. All of the others were kind of a laboratory induction. So, kind of have the person listen to a self as context practice and then respond to emotional content after experiencing the induction of self as context. So only 2 of them are actually intervention trials, and they're not particularly, from a scientific standpoint, they weren't particularly complicated, so they didn't have random assignment or control groups or things like that. So if you're a researcher, there's a ton of work to be done on self as context, and that's kind of interesting. There is a question about how researchable it is, though. And one of the things that I just wanted to briefly mention is that there really are 2 sort of established scales, like psychological questionnaires that pertain to self as context. One of them is called the Self-Experiences Questionnaire, and it has items like, I am able to separate myself from my thoughts and feelings. I have thoughts and feelings, but I am not defined as just my thoughts and feelings. I can observe my experiences in my body and mind as events that come and go, right? So you get the idea there of self as context. And then another one, which is about equally used. I mean, I'd say there's about, if you look at the studies about these two are used pretty much about 50-50. And that's the self as context scale, which is developed by Bob Zettel and his research lab. And it has similar kinds of items. I allow my emotions to come and go without struggling with them. There is a basic sense I have of myself that doesn't change, even though my thoughts and feelings do. I'm able to access a perspective from which I notice my thoughts, feelings, and emotions. So those are some items from the self as context scale. I just kind of wanted to share with you that from the standpoint of empirical research on ACT and ACT processes, those are the ways that people are measuring self as context. And then just as a concluding thought, I wanted to kind of point out some ways in which self as context is perhaps the most central process of what it is to be human. And I say this again from my perspective as a palliative care psychologist. I work with people very frequently at end of life, and one of my favorite research articles in the last 30 years or so is this one that talked about what people find important at the end of life. And I found this to be true in the work that I do with people. These are the things that people find important at the end of life. This I think is about self as context. And people want to be alert and aware. Right? That's a very interesting thing. It's not everybody, but like more people than not, they want to be alert and aware. And in this study from 2000, it was the most important thing to patients. Physicians didn't recognize it as the most important thing to patients, but for the patients, this was the most important thing, to be alert and aware. And then this is the next thing, to be at peace with God, right? So there's this sense of a foundational relationship, that there's some way that some I and thou that is really fundamental to this experience. Like it's the most important thing. When you don't have any time left, this is the thing you're going to do, right? And then this one I totally love, that 88%, look at that, 88% of people at the end of life are saying the most important thing is to be able to help others. That's what I want to be able to do. I want to be able to help others. There's this incredible deictic framing going on at the end of life, where we envision the perspective of others and how we might give something to others and how we could avoid being a burden to others. So there's a sense here, I think, that self as context might be the most important thing in all of our lives, that this might be the thing that matters most, because this is the place where love happens. This is the place from which we do love, if you will. It's this place of a vast, spacious awareness that is flexible and not identified with any particular content. So that's what I have for you. Thank you all very much. Happy, I think we have about 10 minutes left. I can answer some questions if you have any, and I appreciate your attention.
Please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can write something in the chat box for us to share.
I have a question I'd like to ask, if that's all right.
It's all right. It's real loud in this room. It's funny, but yeah, we have a little technological difficulty.
Okay. Oh, is this okay? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Wonderful presentation overall. I have so my specific question is about that slide, I made a note when you were talking about kind of facing the psychological monsters and how it's necessary to kind of position oneself from a place where it's possible to face those monsters. And that place that makes it possible is a sense of self that is kind of unaffected by the content of self. Um, my question is one of practicality. How, according to ACT, do you see as a method or an intervention or a practice or a meditation of cultivating both access and recognition of what that place looks like? Because I think we all have, in times transcendent experiences and we can recognize when they're happening, but we don't know how to access it on a regular basis, or when we're in it, we don't always know how to identify it in a way that allows an easy or realistic return to it. So,
Yeah.
how practically do you see from the lens of ACT going about facilitating that access and recognition to this necessary place?
Yeah, but that's such an excellent question. It's I mean, that in a sense is the heart of ACT, right? So the metaphors are really key to this, and the metaphors that come from the client's own experience. So I think, as you said, most people, or maybe everybody, have these moments of transcendent experience in our dialogue, our therapeutic dialogue with our clients. Potentially those come to the surface, and then those are fertile ground. Those are places to which we can return, and that we can help our clients return to. And some of these canned metaphors and things like the mountain meditation, the chessboard metaphor, these can be helpful too. But the metaphors that come right out of the client's experience, they're going to be the most powerful ones. They're going to be the ones that really carry the water over time for this. But what you're getting at too is that there's a kind of contemplative dimension to this ACT work. I mean, it is a kind of a mindfulness based therapy, and there is some, if you will, contemplative discipline that is helpful here, to practice returning to this perspective, to practice these acts of radical acceptance and these acts of radical diffusion, and to return to them in a, methodical is a kind of boring way to say it, but a persistent way, to persistently and, hopefully gently return to those perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. And as you were talking, I'll just add to that. It's making me think of what opportunities for somatic interventions there are, because if we're talking about, as I agree with you, from the justification, the argument that you're making for this being one of the most important things that we do as humans, well, what role does the body play in accessing that?
Everything. I mean, everything. We had, the most, in some ways, the most important thing is that the body sensations, where we psychologists, we talk about thoughts and emotions all the time. Well, what are emotions, right? They're languaging these physiological experiences, or languaging the body and our embodied experience. That's what we're making room for. The thoughts are relatively evanescent. These bodily experiences are palpable and powerful, and we want to make room for them.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very helpful and educational.
Yeah. All right.
All right, we have a few more minutes. If anyone else like to add any final thoughts, reflections, comments?
Just say hey to some friends that are here, right? So I see a couple of great colleagues here. Mike is in the dark, but Mike Feminella, who I quoted earlier, The place from which we do love is directly from the wonderful work of Mike Feminella. And another terrific Mike, Michael O'Kane here, a great graduate of the Kane program and a person who does a lot of wonderful work with ACT and DBT for people who are struggling with substance use problems. So very grateful to see you both here. Pay attention to them.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
This is a great talk. Thank you so much, Don.
Oh, thank you, Abu. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody, for your attention. Really appreciate it. And hope that if you have any questions or anything that comes up, I hope that you'll send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat real quickly. And if you feel like you want to talk about ACT or talk about self as context, I'd be really happy to get in touch with you or set up a conversation, a phone call, whatever you'd like to do.
And just a reminder, we do have another active process lecture series coming up, and that will be coming up in April. So looking forward to our next coming ACT lecture.
Great, right. And what the next one is the next one the RFT one, or what's the next one?
Next will be committed action.
Committed action. Okay.
On April 12th.
And who's doing that one, Abu?
And that will be Dr. Vidal Anand.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Oh, don't miss that one. He is terrific. I highly recommend that.
Well, thank you everyone again
All
for
right,
your time,
folks.
and have a great rest of your evening.
Bye-bye.